sponsored by Squarespace. Okay, I've got a question to answer today. Where did the Horde go? Like, really, where's the strength and honor? What happened to the Zug? And I know that seems weird, but seriously, the Horde kinda sucks. It doesn't really feel like the Horde anymore. We've all noticed, and, well, here's the problem. It seems that Blizzard don't know how to write Horde stories anymore. Perhaps they're too afraid to write Horde stories. I mean, the whole point is the Horde was the anvil that modern WoW was created on. But after Orgrimmar's second siege, after an endless shuffle of war chiefs and now a kinda limp council, after more Horde giants just exist only to serve an alliance story, we're just left wondering, where has the Horde that we used to love gone? Because the Horde, as we knew it, was one of the defining parts of the Warcraft setting, not just in the fact that they fought the Alliance or the people who looked at the box maybe thought they were bad guys, but no, they added a bit more texture to the world, a little bit more depth to how it was all built. It was in great part the spirit of Warcraft, and now that spirit, the spirit of the Horde, feels like it's dying in the vine. So today, I'm going to explain the problem. I'll define what a true Horde story is, which is a tall order. Maybe I'll fail, but I'll tell you why it doesn't seem to be getting any better, not even now in the depths of the World Soul Saga, where Thrall himself is literally back at the company. I've also got a bit of a challenge for you. Give me 30 minutes and with today's sponsor, you'll finally have the website that you've been meaning to build. So Squarespace is an easy-to-use site builder and award-winning templates, but they have developed so much as a platform lately. Design Intelligence is their mix of tools that help you access their 20 years of design experience easily. It starts with Blueprint AI, and that starts with a few questions. Once you answer those, you'll use their interactive design system to build your own template, just the way that you like it, but with them keeping you right, with designer-picked fonts and color palettes, all matched to your aesthetic, and then from there, you can iterate on your copy and your content. It's all seamlessly integrated, and if you've just been overwhelmed in the past, or you just want to start quickly with all of your bases covered, this set of features is literally made for you. And their core platform is always growing as well. They've got native video support, so you can have a gorgeous player, you can have video gallery layouts that are all interoperable with their e-commerce tools. It's real impressive, and when I needed sites, Squarespace was my first port of call because they make it easy. So to get started today, go to squarespace.com/BellularGaming, check out Design Intelligence, and when you're ready to send your site live, use code BellularGaming for 10% off your first purchase of a site or domain. Of every character I can think of, it's Varrock Saurfang that epitomized the Horde the most. He was the meme of Horde strength. He was absolutely a character to be feared, and he did loads of things that you would consider to be evil, and ultimately a bunch of stuff that did kind of help out the Legion. Of course, though, years later, when we meet him in Orgrimmar, where Thrall has reformed the Horde, changed a lot of their values, actually been able to connect back to old Orc heritage before the Legion manipulated him, well, there he stood. He'd been through the shit, and now he was a beacon of strength and honor, and those were stories that resonated with players. These are people who were in a legitimately dark and bad place, but look how they've changed. Look how they're carving out a new world for themselves, a new life for themselves. And sure, some players just came across him because the Horde racials were stronger and they wanted to raid, or maybe that Orgrimmar was the heart of the dueling scene, so that's why they were there. But I would argue that in large part, it is the aesthetics, it is the stories that resonated with people, that resonated with Blizzard back then, and that set Warcraft apart from a lot of fantasy media. This might sound completely insane to you, perhaps if you've only played the game recently, but back in the day, we used to cry not about alliance bias, but about Horde bias. And even up to the burning of Teldrassil, we cried Horde bias. It just so often felt like they got the more interesting, better written stories. But we didn't really realize something, even by the time of, well, the Shadowlands and BFA. No, the rot had already set in deep. But to get there, we gotta first start with the World Soul Saga, which feels like an alliance playground. The splash art for The War Within is absolutely epic, and of course it tells a story. Just look at it. You have Anduin and Illyria in the foreground, two immense Alliance characters just getting things done. Thrall's there, but he's very much in the shadows behind them. But of course it's not just in the art, and I'm not criticizing that piece of art. It's absolutely epic. It's just kind of funny because Thrall really has been just this weird token background character. We landed in Khazal-Gar, and it very much turned out to be an alliance playground full of classic dwarven lore. That's stuff that I love. But what does Thrall end up doing? Well, Thrall immediately leaves to rally the Horde over to Khazal-Gar. And when he shows up again, the only orcs he could muster were Gera and the other Mag-Har orcs. And they weren't particularly happy. They weren't happy because, once again, the humans were giving them trouble. It may have slipped past you at the time, but basically, the humans were doing some rumbly stuff in the Arathi Highlands, and you can see our video breaking down the Red Dawn for just how dire the telling of faction politics has kind of gotten. But I'll keep it laser focused on the Horde for now. Patch 11.1 brought us to Undermine. Now, this was a chance for some good old goblin-driven Horde stories. But what won out? Well, goblin neutrality. And then that was all filtered through the lens of Illyria and Orwena. Just think about Orwena. The Haranir, the new sort of trolls, actually look like elves. Which I know is a bit of a joke, but you do kind of get the picture. And looking forward, it's only getting worse. Midnight brings us back to Silvermoon, but only because we're reuniting the Lost Elven tribes. Remember that moment in BFA? Maybe you don't, but it's where the Blood Elves were the waiting hammer of the Horde, ready to destroy the Alliance and Lordaeron. Now with Midnight, it seems the Blood Elves will be not really playing much of a factional role because, well, they're going to be heavily involved in the cross-faction A-plot. I get it, you've got to team up when there's a threat far bigger than both of you, but I think some of this does actually cut to the heart of the problem. That's because once, the Horde could advance the plot with their own stories. Whereas I think now, the Horde are often sacrificed on the pyre of peace. And in doing that, I think Blizzard misses out on one of the things that made Warcraft stand out and feel so different. So with that said, let me tell you a true Horde story. The Horde's redemption came with Thrall, so in the transition between Warcraft 2 and 3, something really had to be done. Chris Metzen tried to tell that story through the cancelled Warcraft Adventures game. That obviously didn't really happen, and that lore got repackaged into a novel. That novel is called Lord of the Clans, and honestly, it's a banger. But it all pointed to one thing: stories of heroism also were a thing that belonged to the Horde. They were no longer these pigeonholed bad guys. Then we got Warcraft 3. In that, Thrall sailed across the Maelstrom. He picked up the Darkspear Trolls. Their island had just sank into the ocean, so he saved them, and then that group landed in the Barrens. When there, they saved Karn Bloodhoof and the Tauren from the Centaur. And then, of course, came the Forsaken. They were the people who had survived Arthas. Later, of course, then the Blood Elves as well, who had lost 90% of their population, and they renamed themselves Blood Elves because, literally, of all the blood. So, in all these cases, it's races on the edge of extinction, brought together in common defense against a world that absolutely was not their friend. These stories became the soul of Warcraft. Solidarity, strength, honor. Orcs could be good. Humans could be evil. Everything had edge, like a battle axe mid-swing. But the orc holding it, well, he did it for the right reasons. And now we get to talk about the downfall. Okay, this is where things do get real interesting. So the situation is, it's around the Cataclysm, and Thrall feels like he owes something to Grom Hellscream. Now, if you're not really aware of Grom, basically, he kind of got the orcs into the whole Legion mess. He was drinking the blood. There's other characters with a lot of culpability there. I'm just not going to do an entire lore recap, but basically, he ended up redeeming himself in a big heroic sacrifice in Warcraft 3. Then, in the Burning Crusade, we, well, bump into his son, Garrosh, and basically, with Cataclysm, Thrall decides, you know what, I've got to tend to these elements. I'm basically Jesus now, that's how I'm being wrote. I mean, even harder than how he was previously wrote to be that. And yeah, Garrosh would be the next war chief. Fair enough, I kind of get it. Thrall needed a break after saving the world so many times. But, you know, spoiler warning in case you didn't notice, Blizzard kept needing to bring Thrall back. And this pattern has just continued again and again and again. And it's always been in an attempt to try and retell that core true Horde story. And arguments aside about the meme of Garrosh did nothing wrong. It's a meme, he did do a lot of things wrong. Here's basically what happened. Garrosh was pretty hot-tempered. He gave in to the big hate monster known as the Shah. And this plot honestly was great, it made sense. Blizzard were absolutely cooking at the time. They called it cycles of hatred. It was the factions brutalizing each other again and again, and Garrosh was a natural evolution of all of this. But eventually, it led to the First Siege of Orgrimmar. That's where, say, the Tauren and the Trolls really fought for the honor of the Horde. And eventually, yes, we put Garrosh down. Then we put him on trial. Now, of course, to really get people excited again, they did bring Thrall back for that patch. Just another example of, hey, Thrall's back. We're going to use him for a little bit. But then it doesn't really end up leading to much of a satisfying place. So, Garrosh is imprisoned. He's put on trial. And this gave us the opportunity to bring someone to justice, including the Horde. But then, well, Wrathion busted him out, because Wrathion wanted to build the Iron Horde. What was Wrathion? Well, he was another dragon in the guise of a traditional Alliance race, which in a way was a sign of what was to come. Absolutely don't take the last section of this video as me saying the MoP was bad narratively. No, I actually really enjoyed it at the time. There was a lot of stuff, real sharp writing, big thumbs up. But, well, it's how the narrative then developed after that point that really is where we have problems. So, then came Draenor, a theme park built around slaughtering the greatest names in Orcish history. It wasn't really a self-reflection, there wasn't really much of an earned redemption arc. It was an expansion that, of course, was also cut short narratively. Even when Garrosh saved his father from Gul'dan's demon blood, it only launched a more calculating form of big genocidal energy from the Iron Horde. Now, the epilogue of that story came with the Mag Orcs, and we got the grim realization. In our absence, the Draenei had actually counter-dominated the Orcs on Draenor, and with that, both iterations of Draenor ended up in an utterly destroyed, hellish place. So, it was a lot of big Horde energy, but it wasn't really satisfying from a Horde storytelling point of view. But you know what? That was okay. Sylvanas appeared to be taking center stage. The time for Horde storytelling was back. And of course, the Forsaken had always represented the hard edge of Horde storytelling. I mean, do you remember the Wrathgate? That was an event so brutal it kicked off a faction conflict, one that only ended with BFA. The potential was absolutely humongous, but sadly, this was the beginning of the War Chief Shuffle. Vol'jin was our War Chief at the time, but he quickly took a mortal wound at the Broken Shore. He survived only long enough to do one thing. And as far as last acts go, it really was a strange one. As it turns out, Muzala, an agent of the jailer, told him to put Sylvanas at the head of the Horde as his nominated successor. Everyone questioned the decision because Sylvanas has always been pretty sus. They questioned what she was up to, and it was between one of two choices. Either she was doing another traditional Horde storyline, protecting the Forsaken at all costs, which very much does appear to have been Blizzard's initial plan based on how they communicated the Legion expansion, or, of course, what we ended up getting. Blizzard changing their narrative plans, and a Sylvanas that was cooking up some sort of pure unhinged villainy insanity plan. We know how that went, because it's what brings us to the time where the Horde storytelling truly fell apart. Battle for Azeroth. Time for the Horde's decline to get even faster. The Battle for Azeroth didn't actually kick off with the Siege of Lordaeron. It started shortly before, during what we call the War of Thorns. Sylvanas tricked the Alliance into amassing its forces in Feralus, and once they were set up, well, she marched the Horde right through Ashenvale. And even worse, Alliance forces had been on their way to Silithus. The Horde's armies plowed straight through to Teldrassil, and we players wondered, was Teldrassil going to be a bargaining chip? Was the Horde going to finally consolidate its rule over Kalimdor? Turned out no. No, it would be a brutal massacre. It was the worst aspects of the Horde made real. And Sylvanas' reasons? They weren't even made clear until the Shadowlands. At the time, we players thought that she essentially, well, got really triggered by a dying elf insulting her, and in a moment of anger, ordered the burning of Teldrassil. That's certainly what it looked like, and maybe that was her initial justification with the whole idea of, well, you know, those are all souls destined for the jailer and all of these Shadowlands things. Maybe she rationalized it that way afterward. But what was clear at this stage, is the Horde had fundamentally changed. The downfall of the Horde storytelling became extremely literal now. What this was the sort of action taken by the Horde back shortly after they had drank the blood of Manaroth and they were under the Legion's control. But this time, it was Sylvanas doing it. And here, the downfall of the Horde storytelling became very literal. Varric Saurfang threw his necklace into the fire, and perhaps it's the case that we players loved that storyline because it reflected what we thought about the modern Horde. And so, shortly before the Alliance's counterattack in the Undercity, he takes off his armor and he looks for death. A death that eventually he would find against Sylvanas. He died honorably, he redeemed himself in the eyes of the Horde, but that was it. That was the last avatar of the old Horde, of Zug-Zug, the Horde that we fell in love with. It died all because of his guilt. Guilt for Sylvanas being involved in that, for Teldrassil, for Blizzard perhaps fumbling the Horde bag since the launch of Battle for Azeroth. Throughout that war, we saw Horde storylines that could only advance through one lens, that lens being the eyes of one Anduin Wrynn. Saurfang realized how wrong the Horde was, but only through conversation with Anduin. The good boy, the good dear sweet nice boy, the cinnamon roll with blonde hair, as people on Twitter would refer to him. All, of course, while he was imprisoned by the Alliance. Then we saw Bane Bloodhoof's arc, again, only through interactions with Anduin Wrynn, and where it seemed like Bane was essentially set up to be Anduin, but a cow. Everything was seen through the blue lens of the Alliance, and this led to the final siege of Orgrimmar. Sylvanas announced her plan. We learned that it had been mass murder the whole time. And no shade to the Alliance. I'm an Alliance main, but I know the steel soul of Warcraft lies at the edge of Horde stories, not Alliance stories. It's the Horde that defines what Warcraft is, and for many people this rightly was the nail in the coffin. It was a betrayal of every redemption arc that an orc had ever faced. And with that nail firmly hammered into the coffin, well, it was just time for the long, slow decay of the Horde. After Sylvanas, the Horde did reorganize, but it organized into a council. Obviously, to them, the idea of a war chief was too toxic. No, the Horde couldn't be trusted with that kind of responsibility. So instead, it would be a limp, ineffectual council, one stuck in pure stasis. And who would come to the fore in a position like this? Well, the most powerful faction leaders, which obviously were not orcish. But there is perhaps one character who is the beneficiary of all of this, and that's Lor'themar Theron. Which brings us back to the Horde-shaped problems that could appear in Midnight, where we now have the once High Elves, now Blood Elves, opening their borders to the Alliance. And we really do begin to wonder, what is the point of the factions anymore when everything is so porous and when the Horde's authentic edge has just been sanded away? But of course, that's all the future. First, we would have to deal with what the Horde was sacrificed for, and that is the Shadowlands. Thrall was there for a bit. Bane Bloodhoof was there for a long time, just that he was sitting down in Oribos, rather inexplicably, doing nothing. It's almost as if the writers knew there was a good story to tell, so they put him there, but then just weren't able to follow through and do it. And now we're left in a situation where the average Horde member really does feel much like the average Alliance member. The great souls of the Horde got reduced to cautionary tales. Garrosh, a tale of arrogance. He wound up as a trinket drop in Castle Nathria, and we later saw him in the Sanctum of Domination. Ner'zhul, one of the greatest orcs of all time. Well, we found him in the Sanctum of Domination, completely devoid of anything characterful. He was a tortured shadow of what he once was. None of these characters got the redemption owed not necessarily to them, but to Horde storytelling. The strength, the honor that they deserved. It felt like that type of story was no longer of interest to the writing team at Blizzard Entertainment. Perhaps there just wasn't space, but I would counter to that and say, perhaps they just weren't making the space. Our return to Azeroth brought us to the Dragon Isles, a series of dragons masquerading as elves and humans, really just put the final nail in the coffin of the faction war. Even Ebonhorn had to fight for his position. He's the one aspect who chose to look like a Tauren, and, well, he had to fight 2 humans for it. Now, I'm not blasting the aspects, I'm taking a shot at the writing here. The faction war had ended, but in its wake, it feels like Blizzard can only tell modern stories through one lens, the lens of Alliance characters. I know that often you find groups writing what they know, writing what they see outside them. And at least for those of us who are not in the United States of America, it does seem that WoW's writing got cloistered, inward-looking, and just fundamentally uncreative, uninteresting, derivative, and with a character of unflavored porridge. I think we only need to look at the Avengers Endgame-inspired scene in the Emerald Dream patch of Dragonflight to see that. But then, of course, some things may have changed. We go to Khazalgar. Chris Metzen returns to Blizzard. Next, we're moving to Midnight. Then it'll be the Last Titan. We'll go to a Silvermoon that is open to the world, and then to Northrend in what should be a truly faction-agnostic conflict with the Titans. So where does the Horde fit into that? Where can it regain its soul? If I'm honest with you, it's hard to see, and I don't think it will happen until the expansion after the Last Titan. Because at least right now, this is the brutal reality that is facing the Horde. It's not an orc problem, it's not a troll problem, it's a writing problem. And you can see that problem in abundance with patch 11.1.7's Red Dawn storyline. We published our video on that storyline, well, on PTR, when people hadn't played it, and they thought, oh, you guys are just dooming again for some clicks. I think time proved us right, and if you want to visit that video now, you can do so with this link.